We are in Montague, Michigan, and we'll be interviewing Chuck Vanderlaan. I am Tanya Kabala, and with me is Oscar Osbo, who was doing the videotaping. This interview is being conducted for the White Lake Environmental History Project. Chuck, you've read the interview release form and agreed to that, right?
Yes.
Okay. Would you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself, where you were born, maybe a few family details, and how you ended up in Montague?
Well, let's see. I was born in Muskegon, raised in Muskegon. Left there when I was 17 and a half to join the Navy. That was during the Korean conflict, which according to the news might start up again. After I got out of the Navy, I went to work at Shaw Walker's for a year while I made some money, and then started college at Muskegon Community College. Went there for 2.5 years. Worked for a year at, Whitaker Electric for about 6 months, and then about 9 months at the Muskegon Paper Mill. And then I went down to Western as a junior and spent a couple of years there. Then I went, did my first teaching at Eau Claire, Michigan, down near Benton Harbor. And then there was an opening up here at Montague, and I wanted to get closer to the lake and closer to home, so I took the job at Montague, and I stayed there for 30-some years, retired in '93, and immediately went to work for Grand Valley on their boat, which is an educational boat, the DJ Angus out of Grand Haven. And when we built our new boat, the Jackson, I transferred up to Muskegon and was lead instructor on the Jackson until I retired from there a year ago, after about 20 years boating.
Are you comfortable telling us your age or your birth date?
Oh yeah, October 31st, 1934. I'm 78 years old.
Oh, thank you. What did you teach?
I taught primarily biology, some general science, and also some computer literacy classes, but mostly biology.
And you were a high school teacher?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about what the White Lake area was like when you came here to live?
Well, I remember that we had some friends had a cottage down here on the north side, right at the end of Cook Street, and we used to go over there and picnic a little bit, and the kids would play in the lake. And but that was probably back in the very early '60s, and it started to gain a negative reputation. They sort of closed down the swimming beach at Montague, and people got the idea you can't go in White Lake, and so it was in pretty sad shape at that point.
Do you have any memories, when you lived in Muskegon, you have any memories of White Lake as a child?
Well, yeah, I went up here with my Uncle Albert one time. I was probably somewhere between 6, 7, somewhere along that line, and we went out ice fishing on the Ark. I remember that because it was very impressive. It had this big walk around inside and this big open area that you could fish in, and it was quite light, like the bottom was marl or something, and that I never found later on in my investigation of the lake.
So the lake bottom was white?
At that point, and I think it was located near the, out near the yacht club at the time we visited.
The Ark was anchored out there.
Mm-hmm.
And can you describe what the Ark was?
Well, it was a commercial enterprise that allowed people to come out and enjoy an indoor warm environment, but still ice fish in the center of this big open area in the Ark. And they served a light luncheon type stuff, and it was a unique experience for me. I never went back, but
Did you visit White Lake and swim or use the lake in that fashion as a child?
no. I was in the Muskegon area, and we used Muskegon Lake and Lake Michigan, and Muskegon Lake and White Lake have a lot in common, of course.
Do you, as a child or as a young person growing up, did you ever remember hearing people talk about White Lake or have any impression of White Lake?
Not until after I moved up here, and the impression was going downhill. Okay.
What were some of the early concerns that you heard about White Lake?
Well, first of all, the tannery was a big concern. And I was able to go over there on my own, and also with Wesley, Bob Wesley, and we would enter Tannery Bay, and there was an island in the center of the bay, had bushes growing off it and everything. When you got up close to it, the whole island was made of hides, cow hides, and that was kind of impressive. And there was a big, maybe 14, 16-inch tile coming out from their settling ponds. And I remember one time I brought Sam Townsend and his friend, both from Kalamazoo College. I brought them up here, and Bob Wesley took us out, and we went into Tannery Bay. And when we went in, the factory whistle went off, and a guy come running out there and turning off a big valve to shut off that tile coming from the settling ponds. Because I remember Bob says, it'd be worthwhile just dropping anchor and see how long they could wait before they'd have to turn it back on.
Now, who were the folks from Kalamazoo College?
Well, I can't remember the one. One was Sam Townsend. That was L.D. Townsend, the principal here. That was his son, and he was an instructor at Kalamazoo College. I got to know them because they had a grant, and I spent a summer down there. They had like 12 students in the senior level that were going into biology, and so they were my flock, and I was working with them for that summer on what to expect and whatnot.
Well, what can you tell us about Bob Wesley?
Well, my understanding is that his family used to summer up here on White Lake, and they lived down most of the year down in Chicago, and my understanding also is that he was a commercial artist, and he retired from that. He had real bad, I'd call it emphysema, and he retired early and moved up to the family home on White Lake and got involved with lake problems and became a friend of Whit Dahlstrom's, and the two of them were a real strong impetus for changes to occur on White Lake. They hired Ron Ward to come up and be a consultant and do sampling up here.
Now, who is Ron Ward?
Ron Ward was a new professor at Grand Valley State University, which was a new university at the time, and I think he had a double doctorate, one in, I'm not sure if it was education, and one in science. And anyway, I got to know him a little bit then, and eventually wound up working for him after I retired from Montague.
Now, how did you meet Bob Wesley?
I think it probably was parent-teacher conferences. I had his boys in school, and probably come to conference, and he would express his concern about the lake, and I certainly was very interested in that, and probably didn't talk too much about the kids' progress, more about the lake problems. And he invited me to go out on sampling trips with him.
What kind of things did he and Wint do?
They were very active in trying to whip public opinion up to the point where people got involved and interested in trying to restore the lake. And of course, at that time, the big obvious thing was the tannery. We also had a couple other plants, Hooker Chemical and DuPont, but they they should have paid the tannery for taking all the grief, because they were left alone for a long period of time.
When were the concerns that you're talking about? When were they evident? About when?
Well, the concerns with these other companies.
The tannery.
Oh, the tannery. Oh, this had to be back in. It was mid '60s anyway. Yeah.
Did they? Did the efforts come to fruition? Was there anything done, or?
Well, eventually, but it took years. It really took years. And in the meantime, our two other companies began to show up as not the friendliest type of industries in the environment either. I think it was the C-56 fiasco out on the East Coast that highlighted Hooker's problem.
Mm-hmm. What were the concerns about the tannery that you had, or Bob and Went?
Well, the concern was it was just obviously filthy, old practices from the turn of the century. Whatever was a waste, you threw in the lake, okay? Hides, whatever. Effluent from their settling ponds went into the lake. And it was, like I say, very obvious. The other companies weren't so obvious.
Did they meet with company officials or talk to politicians, or what are some other things?
Every avenue they could, they explored. They attended state meetings of the, I don't even remember, Natural Resources, Water, something.
Water Resources Commission?
Yeah, back before it got changed to DNR, all those changes it went through. But they showed up at meetings there and voiced opinions about reports that the state was putting out that were very shoddy. In fact, Bob pursued that to the point where they actually withdrew that one report that I showed to him. It was horrendous. I went through that thing. He'd underlined everything, and it'd say, this company is sending out 18,000 gallons a day into Lake Michigan. They have a permit to do so, and they're given a rating of A, but it doesn't tell you what's in that effluent. But they still get a rating of A.
What, did Bob have a scientific background, or what was...
Self-taught, I think. A very interesting person. He gave me a paper, and I have it someplace, about his plan for hydrogen-powered vehicles. And he had it all laid out, how you would do it and how you would handle the energy and everything. And some, they've experimented more recently with that concept.
And now there are, I believe, some hydrogen-fueled vehicles.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then what about Wint's background?
Well, Wint was a lawyer, okay, and so he provided a lot of legal expertise for the group that was investigating the problems with White Lake. Like I say, White Lake and Muskegon Lake are kind of like twins in a way. Muskegon Lake is larger, but they both suffer the same consequences. They were listed as of concern by the IGC.
What was the community reaction when Wint and Bob and people like you raised these issues?
Well, to start with, it was pretty, non-committal. Oh, poo-poo, that kind of thing. Eventually, when they got Hooker involved, and it created enough pressure to where the plant actually closed down, people lost jobs. It got pretty nasty for a while. I remember Mary Mahoney was very involved in picketing out there. I think Ralph Rose even laid down in the road to keep vehicles from going out in and out of the plant gate.
And that was in relation to the Hooker chemical.
Yeah, that was Hooker, yeah.
So the tannery itself, people were not as much concerned about, but when the Hooker chemical issue came up,
then they started getting concerned about what's happening to our lake. And obviously we've known right along that the tannery was a real problem. Now we have another problem, Hooker. Eventually they even caught on that DuPont wasn't as nice as it seemed to.
What kind of things did you do? I know you mentioned taking your students out on sampling trips.
Yeah, I had. We never had enough students to have a full biology 2 or advanced level, but I would take volunteer students that were in pretty good academic standard, and we'd work either during their study hall or something. They'd come in and we'd work together, and it was a group. And I had taken my limnology course up at Central Michigan University's biostation on Beaver Island, and got introduced to the Hawk chemical engineering kit, fairly expensive thing. And when I came back, I said, we got to have one of those. And NDEA was still available then, so we got one of these big sampling kits. And I'd take the students out, and my wife would pack a lunch for us, and we'd go out and set up card tables out by the channel and take in water samples and test it for dissolved oxygen and several other parameters.
Was the information useful?
Yeah, well, first of all, it let the students know that there are a lot of things about water that most people don't know about. You know, its pH range, its alkalinity or acidity, its oxygen content, its CO2 content, and also all of the nice little microorganisms that live in water.
You also mentioned a sampling trip with the head of the DNR, the state DNR, where you noticed cattle hair in the lake.
We took samples clear out near the channel, and we were doing bottom sampling using a dredge. We brought it up, and you empty this into a screening box, and then you wash through it. And when we got down to the end, there was cattle hair in there. And we had a person from the state with us. Like I say, I don't know if it was Water Resources Commission or what they called themselves at the time. And Bob pointed out, he says, that's there. You see that? You see that cattle hair? And he said, yeah. He says, I can't put it in my report. If I do, they won't accept it.
And was it a lot of cattle hair?
Not a lot, but it was definitely enough to identify that it washed all the way down the lake from the tannery.
As a teacher, did you suffer any repercussions for being involved in environmental issues?
No, but I danced very carefully around these issues in the classroom. We'd talk about it, but only in a very limited way. We didn't point any fingers at anybody, and because that's not my role. And so I didn't get into any problems with it.
What were the kids' concerns about or thoughts about the lake?
Well, they were concerned, and of course they were in the We Don't Swim There Anymore group.
Do you think what people's understanding of pollution in White Lake has changed over time?
Oh yeah. I've attended over the years enough public meetings to know that we usually garner a larger group than we used to. It used to be you'd have a meeting and, you'd get to speak to the choir. But now you get a pretty good sampling of public that come to these meetings.
How do you feel the issue of pollution affected the White Lake area?
Well, it had a negative impact. I mean, you'd hear from people that didn't live here but had heard about it and didn't want to come here.
Were you aware of any local protests about pollution, or did you join in any local protests?
I didn't do too much. Again, we were encouraged not to get too involved in that kind of stuff, being public school teachers. But we had some very vocal groups that did picketing and whatnot at the Hooker plant. And they were essentially responsible eventually for the closing down of the plant. Once it became common knowledge that they were big polluters also. In fact, one of my students came to see me. I was working out in the backyard, and he was telling me he worked at Hooker, and he was telling me about some of the things that went on. And I said, well, he says, you know, what should I do? And I said, well, Gene, you're going to have to, actually his name was Warren, but he went in my class by the name of Gene, Eugene. And I said, you're just going to have to make up your mind. Whatever you do, there'll be consequences. Eventually he was fired because he became a whistleblower, talked about the stuff that they were hiding out in the woods and the barrels and whatnot. His name was Dobson.
Warren Dobson.
Yeah, Warren Dobson.
What was your viewpoint of government during the time when these pollution concerns were raised?
Well, for a long time, government didn't want to hear it because you were putting pressure on local industry that provided jobs, and so that was their main focus, you know. Mm-hmm. And eventually, they sort of fell in line, but they weren't leaders.
What about community leaders? What, you know, people who were considered to be leaders in the community? What was their take on the issue?
Well, they got very involved. You certainly know that, being involved as you are, and I tried to make as many of these meetings as I could, but when I got to working for Grand Valley, my schedule was so impossible that it was hard to make a lot of the meetings that we had. But
well, you've been involved with cleanup efforts relating to White Lake, which is what you're talking about now. Do you want to say anything about just the several decades effort to clean up White Lake?
Oh yeah. I was on board the Jackson, and we brought it up to White Lake to do some sampling in Tannery Bay. And at the time, it wasn't an educational trip, so I was on board just as a volunteer. And we took samples. Rick Radesky, who's the chemist from WRI, and his son were there in their paper suits, collecting these big containers of bottom sediment, which they analyzed very carefully. I was up here with another group one time, and we brought a sampling outfit that was really cool. It was a big tube, and then there was another tube inside of it with space around it. The inner tube, the inside tube, was filled with dry ice, and we dropped this down into the sediment and let it set for 5 or 10 minutes, and what it'd do is it'd freeze all the water around it, and all the sediment around it. Then we'd bring it up and empty out the dry ice, pour warm water in that, and then slide this cylinder of sediment out and cut it up into samples, so they could sample it by every centimeter from the bottommost centimeter on up to the surface, and they could chemically analyze what was in each centimeter and to what concentration, so they could trace these sediments through time.
That was the water in the sediments?
It was the sediment itself, actually. It was like a big frozen mud tube that we brought up and then sectioned, put in containers and put the dry ice in there. And then when they got it back to the lab, they would section it centimeter by centimeter.
Now, what was the result of that sampling effort?
Well, it told us when PCBs became most common and when they were most concentrated at what stage in the history of this sedimentation process, and other materials other than that, lead and mercury and some of the other things.
What other activities relating to cleanup are you aware of?
Well, they did, as a result of the sampling done in Tannery Bay, eventually when they got to the point of cleaning up the mess, it required thousands of yards of sediment being taken right out of the lake and sent to a landfill to try and remediate that area.
As far as cleanup of the Hooker Chemical site or the tannery site or other sites like Muskegon Chemical, what do you think about those cleanups? Are they?
Well, I know they spent some time. I have some pictures somewhere of the special dredge that they used out on White Lake near the outfall of Hooker's pipeline out there, and it was referred to as the dead zone. Our samples taken from that area showed absolutely no living benthic organisms in that area. And so they arranged to send this dredge. It looked like a crane type thing went down and would take the sediment and completely enclose it, bring it up through the water column and dump it into a barge. And they tried to remove as much of that sediment as possible. And then of course they put in sampling wells between Hooker and the lake, several of them, where they pump the water out and run it through carbon filters and whatnot to improve the flow of material from groundwater to the lake.
Are you familiar with the cleanup of Hooker Chemical when there were protests because of other waste being brought in?
Oh yeah, well they had to run those things right past my house to go to the landfills, and they dug this huge pit out there, which they then lined with clay. They got the clay from this moraine right up here and transported there and completely lined this pit with, I think it was 10 or 12 feet of clay. And then they tore down the plant and all the equipment that was used to manufacture things like C-56, that all went into this pit, which was eventually covered up to make a mound, and it's still there.
And so you saw the trucks go past?
Oh yeah. And they had to have covers on them and everything because they didn't want to leak this stuff all over the environment. But yeah, right down the road.
Were you aware of the complaints that waste from other company or another cleanup was entering the vault?
Well, I had heard that, but I didn't know much about it. I didn't hear any direct sources reporting stuff from where. I mean, I guess they thought it was a good idea. If you have this wonderful vault you're making, let's utilize it to its fullest extent. But I'm not even sure that vault is that good anymore.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Wint Dahlstrom? Wint and Betty?
Well, I didn't know her as well. Wint I knew. I actually watched him present a case in court one time. The counselor and the English teacher and me as a science teacher was invited by the judge, who at the time was Ralph Rose, to come down and watch this case, which was one of our former students dealing with dope and whatnot. And so I got a chance to watch Wint in action as an attorney in court. Otherwise, I only knew him through the sampling expeditions and whatnot. He always took he took the purist approach. If you said we could do this, he'd say, well, why not do that? It's even better. He wanted to press it to the maximum cleanup possible.
Some people said he was kind of ahead of his time, as far as knowledge of environmental issues.
Yeah, I think it ran in the family. I think one of his sons is strongly involved in the windmill type projects around to create energy from using the wind.
Is there anything else you'd like to mention about the tannery?
No, other than it's gone, and it's supposedly going to be, the area is going to be redeveloped into housing and condos and whatnot. It's been a long time coming, and I guess there's still some holdups. You don't see a whole lot moving down there. I drive by every now and then. Don't see too much going on.
Do you have anything else to add about Hooker Chemical or any other chemical companies?
Well, it's kind of interesting, but I think both Hooker and DuPont originally wanted to locate in East Muskegon, out in the county there. And both were turned down by the county. And so their alternative was to move up here. And of course, Hooker came because they wanted to get at the salt deposits down below. And DuPont actually could use some of the byproducts of Hooker, and so that was a good invitation. Let me see, their first product was neoprene, I think, which was a rubber-like substance, an insulating substance. My experience with that is we used some of their neoprene-coated cable to rewire an airstrip in Adak, Alaska. And it's the toughest stuff to cut through and barrier wire. Really tough stuff. But that was one of their products that they made. And like we find out after the fact, they weren't quite as nice as we thought they were.
What do you think their initial reaction to the companies coming to town was?
Oh, it was great. You know, these are jobs. These are jobs coming into the community. And they had some good things too. I mean, a lot of their upper employees, administrators, whatnot, got involved in local politics, got on school boards, things like that. And they came from outside and they brought new ideas in. And, if we just look at the building programs that Montague went through, a lot of it was due to the influence of these outsiders, so to speak, bringing new ideas into the community.
Do you think there's been a change in community attitudes about chemical companies or just companies that that may pollute in general? I think there is. There's a kind of an awareness, an almost leery type of attitude towards industry, until it comes right down to, we're going to bring so many new jobs in. Then they kind of forget the environment a little bit. The jobs mean money. What do you see for the White Lake area in the future?
Well, we're still involved in cleanup at Hooker. We're still involved in cleanup at DuPont. And that's going to be ongoing for quite some time yet. I don't know how that's going to affect the community. We have some other companies that have come in and they also brought their pollution problems with them and have screwed up the groundwater in the outlying Montague area. I don't know. I'm getting the thought that the industry is starting to learn a lesson that you can't just come in and pollute an area. You have to take care of your own waste and whatnot and do it right.
Do you see a difference in government these days?
Yeah, but again, government is always looking at the dollar. They want to bring jobs in. Now, can they bring jobs in without screwing up the environment is the big question.
What about the state and federal environmental agencies? Is there a difference in their attitudes or approach based compared to in the 60s and 70s?
Oh, I think so. At least I haven't heard any comments like, well, I could put that in my report, but my superiors won't accept the report. I don't think that's happening to that extent anymore.
Well, what do you see as the community's greatest needs in relation to environmental protection?
Oh, I guess what we have to do is keep citizens very much aware and get them on our side, let's say, on the environment side, so that when a new company proposes something that people look at it and say, well, what about this? And what are you going to do about that? And in other words, question how they're going to operate in this area.
Is there anything you would like to add?
Oh no, I've said enough. I could, go on and on and on forever, but I think we've hit the high points.
Well, thank you very much, Chuck.
Oh, you're welcome.